Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's David in Enfield. Hi, David.
Good evening, panel. At PMQs, Boris Johnson said, quote, "The problem with the Labour Party today is that he, Starmer, is a lawyer, not a leader." So would the panel prefer a lawyer or a liar as Prime Minister?
I think that's what's called a loaded question, isn't it? Leanne Wood.
I want neither. I want a leader, and a leader would be someone who could make sure that they had integrity, honesty, because leaders are followed. And if those leaders don't have that honesty and integrity, then those who work with them, they pick up bad habits and so on. So lawyers have their place, of course. I'm not against lawyers, but lawyers are not necessarily good leaders. They may be good legislators. They may be good at scrutiny and tackling the detail, but leadership requires a lot more than those skills. And I'm afraid what I see at Westminster is a lack of leadership on both sides. I mean, I'm not going to let the Prime Minister off the hook. The antics of him recently have been absolutely appalling. And it makes the case for the kind of politics that I'm interested in, which is creating a space here in Wales to be able to do something differently. So I say neither lawyer nor liar, but real leadership here in Wales, built from the grassroots up, and being able to create a completely different kind of politics to what we're seeing at Westminster, because I think that's utterly broken by now.
Okay, Denise.
I'm unmuted. So good evening. Thank you. So in terms of the question, leader or lawyer, I think the country does definitely need a leader. And what we've had from Boris, unfortunately,
well, actually, Denise, the question was a lawyer or a liar.
Well, the question about, I'm not going to say whether he's a liar or not. I think people know that he has a difficult relationship with the truth at the moment. But definitely, you do want a leader with integrity and a leader that people can trust. And I think Leanne made the point quite well about having someone that you can follow, because I think the whole point of our two-party system is to coalesce around people with really good and strong ideas. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. We're seeing a real disconnect between a distance from consequence and rules that everyone expects us all to abide by, especially when you're making the rules. In terms of the question, do we need a lawyer? I think you need lawyer skills in the government, because that's what the government's for, basically. You know, it writes statutes so that we have laws and we abide by them. But that's not the only skill you need in an opposition. I do think you need someone who can galvanise people. And I think Keir Starmer is making some waves, but he's a little slow off the trot.
Slow off the trot, I love that expression. Antonia, what's your answer to David?
Well, I think it's a sad indictment of the state of politics that the term lawyer is now bandied around as an insult. I don't think lawyer and leader are mutually exclusive. There's no reason why Keir can't be a lawyer and a leader of the country. But I think your caller points to a wider question of trust in democracy overall. And I think we need to look at, your caller's comment in the wider context of the state of politics at the moment. And the state of politics is in absolute crisis. As we know, we've got PM who doesn't know if he went to his own party, doesn't know if he followed his own rules. But prior to that, what have we seen? We've had a year of contracts being handed out to the government's mates. We've had broken promises around 40 new hospitals, real kind of uncertainty around what this levelling up agenda is. The list goes on. So whether we want a lawyer or a liar, we want trust in democracy fundamentally to be restored.
Peter Bone, I think you had a few sound problems at the beginning, but David in Enfield's question is, would you rather a lawyer or a liar as Prime Minister?
Well, I want someone who can lead the country and do the right thing and make the right calls and get the big questions right. And I think that's what we've got in the Prime Minister. He inherited a parliament that was broken. He got through that. He won a general election. He got Brexit done, which people said he couldn't do. He got a free trade agreement, which people said he couldn't do. Then we were hit by COVID. He's led us through COVID. He made the big calls on COVID right. We got the first vaccination in the world, which that vaccination has now been given to 2.7 billion people, saving the lives of millions of people around the world. He's got the economy going again. We get coming out of COVID restrictions before anyone else. So I want someone who can make the correct decisions, and that's what the Prime Minister has done. So the simple answer who I want to lead the country is Boris.
But are you not frustrated by the amount of occasions where it can demonstrably be proven that he has had a very loose relationship with the truth? I haven't liked people sort of hurling the word liar about, but there are so many occasions now that it's almost impossible to say to a guest who comes on the programme, can you please not use that word?
Well, I'm afraid you'd have to give a specific example, Iain, because it seems to me what people are worried about is, well, for instance, there were 60 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine that the Prime Minister bought for insurance, and lo and behold, it's proved necessary with the COVID booster programme. I'm much more, I think, not just me, but I think most people are more interested in that than whether he ate a Marks and Spencer's cake.
Somebody said, I think I saw it on Twitter earlier today, that Keir Starmer missed a good line in PMQs today, because when Boris Johnson started almost sort of disparaging lawyers or ridicule them, Keir Starmer ought to have said, well, you shouldn't disparage lawyers, Prime Minister, you might need one soon. Which, given the policing, well, who knows? I wouldn't want to prejudge that. David, I'm assuming, given your question, well, actually, let's come back to you. Answer your own question.
Well, I tend to agree with the issue about a lawyer is not necessarily suitable to be a leader, because I think Keir Starmer's problem, he seems to be coming out of his bit now, is that he has a distinct lack of charisma. So I have a question mark there. As far as the Prime Minister is concerned, he may have accomplished quite a few things, but for me, I think this whole issue with Partygate is actually is causing people's trust in democracy to decline further, sort of antics we're seeing in the House of Commons. And, I value honesty, integrity, and selflessness as the key characteristics of a good leader, and I don't think Boris has those. He's proved he hasn't had them over the years.
OK, David, thank you. Joe in Epsom has got an associated question. It's a really good question, this, I think. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, Iain. My question for the panel is, what do they feel that young people today are learning about leadership from current events and the behaviour of, the people who are in charge of us?
Well, I'm going to go to the person who I think is the youngest on the panel, Antonia. I'm not going to say that you represent all younger people, but it is quite a difficult one, this, isn't it? Because you sometimes look at what's going on in politics and you think, well, what are people supposed to make of it? Particularly maybe younger people who are quite interested in politics and maybe even have thought of pursuing a political career.
Yeah, I think, the first thing to say is, sadly, the gap between the average young person and the Houses of Parliament has never seemed bigger. And frankly, we deserve better than that. What we're seeing, and probably what the Gray report is going to make clear, is that a particular group of politicians and their advisors have made choices to put themselves above the rest of us time and time again. And this has spread throughout the Conservative Party, creating a real culture of corruption that, the establishment needs to face up to. So, I obviously don't speak on behalf of all young people, but I doubt they see a very inspiring place. And, there's that old adage of you can't be what you can't see. And frankly, still, diversity within the Commons is pathetically low, whether it comes to LGBT representation, BAME representation, women. And I think we desperately need to change that, both to give young people something to look up to, but also to change the culture itself.
I'm going to slightly push back on you on that one, because if you look at female representation in the House of Commons, the Labour Party have got 51% of their MPs are female. I think the Conservatives is about 33. And on gay representation, it's well over 10%, which you could argue is possibly a bit overrepresented.
Well, fine. Obviously, the Tories have a large majority in this country. So if you take their, 30 odd percent and combine it with Labour, still it is well under 50% female representation within the Commons. So we don't have equal representation. But, there's this wider point here around Partygate, and, time and time again, we're seeing Parliament being misled, or if not explicitly misled, wool pulled slightly over their eyes. And I totted up today how many parties the government is alleged to have had through the lockdown, and that's just the parties we know about. And so far it amounts to 15, right? So they're the gatherings at number 10, Johnson's birthday, whatever Sean Bailey was doing with the Tories in London, Treasury drinks, leaving events, the list goes on, 15 parties, right? And do you know what I was doing during those 15 parties in lockdown? I was looking after my dying father, whose cancer diagnosis arrived late because he was instructed to shield, right? So the buck has to stop somewhere, and it has to stop with the Prime Minister. He's so deeply insulted my family and hundreds of thousands of others. And for the sake of standards in public life, he absolutely has to go.
Peter Bone, what are current events teaching young people today about leadership?
Well, I'm not sure that whether it's a young person, middle-aged person or an older person, they have a particularly different view. They want to see strong leadership and people actually making the right calls. I've got a lot of people involved in my local association who are young people who are out canvassing as we speak tonight. So I don't recognise that there is a difference between that. They want to see good leadership. And I have to say, if someone has got the first vaccination in the world, partly because we came out of the European Union, but we still had to do it, and we've saved millions of lives, 2.7 billion injections of AstraZeneca now across the world. I would have thought young people, old people, middle-aged people will think, well done, the government, for doing that. I don't think you should distinguish between different ages. I think everybody wants to see that sort of thing.
But what about Antonia's points about all of these different events where clearly, some of them are sort of, to one extent or another, are more serious or less serious than others. But the Prime Minister and Number 10 have admitted now that this birthday event in Number 10, that was a clear breach of the rules. The Prime Minister was there. It was a social gathering, even among work colleagues. And as Antonia says, that there are too many of these events for them all to be just swept away and explained as, they're not very important.
Well, I think hopefully, maybe even tomorrow, Sue Gray will explain what happened and what they were. But the cake one, goodness me, you're working all hours of the day and night in Downing Street. Downing Street is a 3-storey office block. And then you break off to take a piece of cake to the Prime Minister, and you go back to work, within 10 minutes. And I tell you anything you like, you know what it's like, Iain. When politicians and staff get together, what do they talk about? They talk about work. So
I know, but there were 30 people.
Party, nobody.
Neither of us have been cabinet ministers, Peter, but I'm sure we all know the size of the cabinet room. And there were 30 people in that cabinet room at a time of lockdown when even the cabinet wasn't meeting because they were doing it via Zoom. They weren't socially distanced. It was a social event. But is there anything, is there anything that Sue Gray could say that would sort of lighten or loosen your support for the Prime Minister?
Well, the whole point of the independent report is to see what it says, and people like myself will make our mind up when we hear it. I have to say the cabinet room is pretty big. I agree that you're more likely to become a cabinet minister than me, but it's not a small room.
I would agree with that. Possibly not under Boris Johnson, though. Denise Headley.
I think the question about what the current situation is teaching us about leadership is that there is distance from consequence. If you are powerful and you are able to, come across from a particular social group, you can obfuscate rules and the same restrictions that apply to everybody else. And I think that what is teaching us about leadership is that we don't realize just how fragile our democracies are. Democracies are experiments. They haven't been in place forever, and they're built on trust, and they're built on almost like a contract. And if you consistently see that contract being broken, then you'd start to have doubts about the value of that system. So I think it's really important that you don't just try to minimize wrongdoing on the basis that, you just happen to be, I think, what was it, ambushed by a cake. The facts are you aren't supposed to conduct yourself in a certain way. And that's clearly what's been happening. You've been doing it wrong. I also think it shows a culture of obfuscation. You can move to the side slightly or slightly hoodwink or gaslight people. And people are aware of that. They are aware of it. And then it's this minimizing of the importance. I mean, let's not forget, we're still waiting for an inquiry into the volume of people who died. We have the biggest number of people who died in Europe from COVID. And we're still waiting for that inquiry. And we're talking about parties and we're talking about the Prime Minister's behavior. And I think really and truly, we this culture of favoritism and relationships, it actually creates an unpalatable relationship with your government. And I think that's where we are. A lot of people are grossly disappointed.
Leanne Wood.
Thankfully, I think most young people can smell the bull and they can see through the obfuscation and they understand that this is poor leadership. I mean, Boris Johnson has taken a laissez-faire attitude right the way through the pandemic. Right at the beginning, he was shaking hands with people. He was refusing to wear masks. He has broken the rules that he has written at every step of the way. And I think most young people that I know, and I've got a 17-year-old daughter, they would never dream of behaving in the way that he has. And I think most young people would look at him with disgust, actually. There are 160,000 people who have died with COVID since the start of the pandemic, and that's probably an underestimation of the real numbers. And we're talking about, isn't he marvellous for introducing the vaccination programme? The vaccination programme is fantastic. I pay tribute to the NHS and the scientists who have helped to deliver that. And yes, of course, it was helped along with government support as well. But that's just one part of the disaster that has been this pandemic. There have been so many terrible, horrific stories. So many lives have been lost needlessly. There could have been action taken at different points in the pandemic which would have protected lives. So I think the lessons for young people from leadership here are how not to do it. I, for one, with the young people that I know anyway, have a lot of hope that the future generations will be a lot better than the generations that have gone before them.
Thank you all for your answers. Let's quickly go back to Joe in Epsom. How would you like to answer your own question, Joe?
I think that certainly the last two answers echo how I feel. I mean, I think that we're right. There are, most young people today have the common sense and the intelligence to see through it. What I worry about is those who are, forming or, vulnerable to the notion that, leadership allows you access to systems that can protect you if you're not prepared to face up to, the mistakes that you've made. So, those are the people I worry about, really.
OK. Joe, thank you very much indeed for your question. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:20. 23 minutes past 8 on LBC. Peter Bone, Antonia Jennings, Denise Headley and Leanne Wood with me answering your calls. Rob is very angry with you, Peter. He says, how can you let this guy attribute AstraZeneca's global vaccine to Boris? Would have happened with or without him. Quick response?
Well, the matter is that the Oxford vaccine was developed because of government money, and it was done because we came out of the EU and it was achieved. I mean, I wish Boris's opponents would at least give credit for the major successes he's had, because otherwise I'm afraid their arguments look as though they just hate Boris.
Right, David in Swansea says, were the Treasury, or should it be was the Treasury, I'm not sure, were the Treasury correct to write off £4.3 billion worth of furlough fraud? Antonia, let's come to you first on this.
No, I don't think they were right to do so. And I actually think the signalling on this kind of more broadly and internationally is quite problematic. I'm sure we'll get to Ukraine a bit later on, but obviously our next moves around the Russia-Ukraine situation are going to be very important, as are our longer term kind of signals around it. And one thing that we do know is that there's a lot of problematic, let's say, Russian money that flows through London, and action against criminal financing and that offshore money is absolutely imperative for international diplomacy and Britain's place in the wider world. And if we don't have our own house in order domestically, people around the world aren't going to have confidence in us.
Leanne Wood, is it fair to say that if you set up any kind of government scheme in a very short time, and a lot of these schemes were set up within weeks of the pandemic starting, inevitably there are going to be loopholes which evil people will exploit? Now, what's your view on this 4.3 billion? Obviously, we're all going to say we'd love it to all be recovered, but do you think that was ever going to be realistic?
Well, it would have been good to see at least some effort being made to try to recover it, really, wouldn't it? Because we also know, don't we, that a lot of those contracts that were awarded in the height of panic were awarded to friends and associates of people close to the government and people who've donated money to the Conservative Party.
But we're talking about furlough fraud here, particularly.
Okay, so that's specific to furlough, but the wider question about the spending of money, where it went, how easy it was given away and to whom it was given away, does need to see some much stronger light shone on it, I think. Because the thing is, right, you can write off 4.3 billion pounds, but you can't afford some of the basics that keep people off the breadline. The universal credit, £20 wasn't affordable, even though that increase was actually quite paltry. It's unaffordable to help people with their fuel bills. It was unaffordable to give needy children free school meals, yet this is money that can be easily written off. So yes, you're right. I mean, it's difficult to create a scheme quickly that doesn't have any loopholes in it at all. But I think those cases should have been looked at a lot more closely, pursued a bit harder, because that is money that could be making a big difference to many, many people who are living below the poverty line.
Peter Bone, Lord Agnew resigned as a Treasury and Cabinet Office Minister over this. He was the minister responsible for getting this money back. It was quite extraordinary, some of the allegations that he was making about civil servants just not being interested in recovering this money. And you're thinking, well, surely what you do then as a minister is go to the Chancellor and say, I need you to step in here. And it seems Rishi Sunak did not do that.
Well, I mean, it was a dramatic resignation. I haven't seen anything quite like it. And he rightly said, of course, if this results in some action being taken, it was a good day's work. And the truth of the matter is what he was complaining about was the civil service and not chasing the people who defrauded the country. And it's very interesting. I was in an urgent question today in the Commons where, in fact, the minister at the dispatch box said they are going to go after these people. He named a couple of banks. I think he said NatWest and HSBC were particularly bad. But I remember in the height of the lockdown, I was locked in my flat with my partner who did all the work for me at the time. And people were desperate every day to make sure they had money to survive. And whether it was through furlough scheme or loans or grants. And we worked tremendously hard at it. And the government did. And local authorities did. Now, I'm not going to complain if anyone paid some money to people they shouldn't, because they were working very hard to get money out. I was really delighted that money went quickly. I'd much rather have had it then that way than weeks and weeks of checks before they got the money. I think you've got to remember how desperate people were. And some of these schemes were actually developed in days. And well done to the government and well done to local authorities for administering the schemes.
Denise Headley.
I'm astonished, basically. I mean, how can you not recover £4.3 billion? How does that get lost? I mean, the money was paid to employers, and that means that there has to be some kind of audit trail. I mean, I've worked in the benefit agency for years. You miss £10 off your council tax or off your universal credit, they are on you like a ton of bricks. So how come this didn't happen here? I'm just amazed, and I think it speaks volumes, like Leanne was saying. Sorry, I think it speaks volumes to what Leanne was saying, is that there's always money available for certain sections of the community. They can always find the magic money tree. And I think, frankly, this is disgraceful.
There were apparently 1,000 companies that were given money. I can't remember whether this was on the furlough scheme or whether it was on the bounce back loan scheme. 1,000 companies were given money and they weren't even trading. And
Iain, you're right. Iain, you're right. It was.
Yeah, but how did that come about?
Well, it was the bank.
You can't claim 10 pence from the DWP without
okay. All right, Denise. Sorry. Let Peter answer the question.
It was just that I was in the Commons when this was brought out, and it was these bounce back loans which were given to companies that didn't exist. And there are questions whether, I think particularly NatWest and HSBC did rudimentary checks. So I think there's a real question there, and those banks should be looked at to see whether the money can be got back from them. But the fact that saved many, many people from going into complete poverty at the time of the COVID pandemic, at the height of it, is a credit to the government. But if banks didn't do the really basic stuff, then they should pay the money back to the government.
Right, thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your calls in a moment. It's 8:35. Now, we don't normally do questions to one individual panellist, but I'm going to make an exception here. And if anybody else wants to chip in as well, feel free. But Leanne Wood, you are the target of this question. It's from Chris in Balham. He says he's Cardiff born and Cardiff bred. He says, Plaid, Cymru and the Labour Party within Wales have recently been increasingly cooperating on some issues. If a general election was imminent, would you and Labour be willing to act in an anti-Tory front? I'd emphasise this would need to be on a UK-wide basis, not just Wales. What do you reckon?
Thanks for the question, Chris. If you remember back to the election, the UK general election of 2015, we talked at that point where David Cameron was the Prime Minister, where he was putting forward a Brexit referendum, that we should work with other progressive parties to try to stop that happening. And sadly, at that point in time, that offer was rejected by Labour. And you may remember there were posters with Nicola Sturgeon featured in the pocket of Ed Miliband and all of that kind of propaganda campaign.
I think it was the other way round, to be honest, but...
Oh, right, yeah, sorry, yeah. But you get the drift, don't you? And I just think that there was an opportunity there, and there were opportunities after that as well, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, to work more collaboratively to try to stop some of these policies that we knew would be really harmful to people who are struggling, you know. But it wasn't to be at that point in time. Fortunately, there has been more cooperation on a Welsh level between Plaid Cymru and Labour. There's been a good programme put together, which includes giving free school meals to children to help alleviate poverty, and a raft of measures designed to improve the lives of people living in this country that can only really be delivered with a strong Senedd, which this cooperation agreement gives. So I'm quite hopeful for potentially future collaborations as well, but I think attitudes need to change on the part of the Labour Party in the UK before that can happen, because they've been very rejecting of cooperation up until this point.
OK, Leanne, Simon in Southend wants you to know that he's your biggest fan. You can't get much further from Wales and Southend, can you? Let's go to Adrian in Berlin. Hello, Adrian.
Good evening, panel. Great show, Iain.
Hi.
Now that the UK has left the EU,
do you think that it has become a minor player politically and economically in the world, following the rules that others make, such as the EU, the US and China?
Peter Bone.
Absolutely not. I mean, we talked about it earlier on, that the AstraZeneca vaccine, 2.7 billion, only came about because we were outside of the EU. And if you want a more up-to-date example, look at Ukraine. We're leading the European response to that. The European Union is arguing amongst itself what it should do, and we're getting on and supporting NATO allies. I mean, it's just reversed. Outside of the EU, we're leading. So I find that question, I have to very simply say no to that question.
Denise.
I'm in complete disagreement with Mr. Bone, because I think we have become a complete, our power has diminished considerably since leaving the European Union. And also, I think one of the clear examples of that is what happened in Afghanistan. When Mr. Biden was leaving, there was no conversation with us or anyone else, and we are supposed to be a very strong...
Or the EU.
But that's what I'm saying. There was none, and basically we were just left. So I don't think we're in a strong position. I think what's important to a lot of people is to keep on thinking that Brexit is going to make us stronger, when in fact it's actually weakened us. We've seen our pound fall, and our influence in the world has fallen. So unfortunately, I'm in agreement that we're not as strong as we used to be.
Well,
they can't get away with that. I mean, look, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7.
We're in recession, Mr. Bone. We're not moving. We weren't in a place. We weren't in a good place before.
If you want to argue with the facts, just look at them. We're growing by 4.7%. It's 3-point-something% for Germany and France and Italy. We are leading. You cannot make arguments.
Denise, please. I mean, if two people talk together, particularly when you're remote, nobody can hear a word you're saying. So let's try and... I mean, but the fact is, Peter, yes, we are growing faster than any other European country, but we also start from a lower base because we had a bigger recession during the pandemic than other countries did.
Well, I'm just pointing to the fact that we are growing better than anywhere else. And if you think about it, many people thought, and I expect the three guests that are on with me all thought that Brexit would bring us to our knees and it would be the end of the world. I remember those sort of things that, we were going to be thousands and thousands of pounds better off, worse off, and that's just completely.
And also, we should also point out, Denise, the pound is actually at its highest level since Brexit. It hasn't actually fallen. Antonia.
Our economy might be growing, but as you point out, we were starting from a line that was further back than other countries. And also, growth isn't the ultimate economic metric. And actually, if you look at who is benefiting from the growth, it's a very small number of people in this country. But more broadly, Britain's place in the world was in large part reliant on its soft power and history and legacy of empire over its hard economic power. Its hard economic power was definitely stronger when it was part of the EU, which made it part of the largest trading bloc in the world. Now that we've isolated ourselves from that, our soft power is further diminishing alongside our economic power. And in terms of, being a major player of global importance, we pale in insignificance compared to, the likes of China, India, the US, etc.
Well, that's partly because they're much bigger countries and much bigger economies. That almost is inevitable. But how have we lost soft power?
We had a seat at, the table of the EU, and by virtue of that fact, we could veto, anything that the EU was trying to pass. And the EU, as I said,
well, that's not true either.
Well, the EU member states each have the power of veto.
Over a comparatively small number of areas, because the veto has been eroded over the last 30 years. Now, admittedly, we signed up to all of that, so it's our own fault that we didn't have the veto over a lot of things. But it is just simply a fact that we did not have veto over most EU legislation.
Okay, well, without going into the ins and outs of that, I would maybe put to Peter Bone, how on earth could you possibly contend that our soft power has increased in this country? We've had the largest recession, we've had one of the worst death cases, from COVID globally. Growth is happening, but for a very select few. How on earth could you say, in terms of soft diplomatic power in the world, we've increased our standing?
Well, very simply, we're one of the biggest donors of overseas aid in the world. And
we cut that.
But yes, your government cut that time and time again.
Yeah, but the other people you're talking about never have come up to the level that we are doing. So that we are, well, around the world, we are doing great things for people with money from our British taxpayer. And of course, you have to, and you go back to the vaccination. 2.7 billion, that's a pretty extraordinary number of people who wouldn't have that jab if it hadn't been for what the British government done. I think that's really important soft power.
Okay. All right. You do rely on the vaccine rollout quite heavily for a lot of your arguments, Peter, don't you?
Well, that's because nobody seems to give credit for it. I mean, don't you? I mean, look, put the political nonsense to one side. Doesn't everybody think that's just an extraordinary achievement?
Peter, I will say to you that yes, the vaccine rollout in this country has been impressive, but still, we're the 6th largest economy in the world by some metrics. But yet, we have 1 in 3 children in poverty. I'm sat here in East London, next door to Canary Wharf, the financial hub of, possibly the world. And that figure rises to 1 in 2. 1 in 2 kids on my doorstep in the block I live in poverty. So that's the legacy of this government, not the vaccine rollout, which frankly, we have more to thank the NHS for.
Okay, Leanne Wood. Shall I just remind you of the question? Now the UK has left the EU, is the UK still a major player on the world stage?
I think the UK's power and influence has diminished on the world stage as part of Brexit, but I think that's part of a long, ongoing diminishing of that power. And thankfully that's happened, because there was a point where the Britain owned 85% of the land mass of the world. And
those were the days, Leanne, those were the days.
Well, I'm glad those days are over, because colonialisation and imperialism has left us with a serious headache today, and so many people are paying the price as a result of that. So why are we even seeking to be a major world player? Major world players spend huge amounts of money on defence. Major world players are more interested in going to war than looking after their people. So why don't we aim to be a minor player? Why don't we just seek to look after the people that we are responsible for governing, rather than trying to have influence elsewhere in the world? Yes, of course, be part of wider movements to help people be protected when they come under threat, if they're vulnerable. But, there is far too much militarism, far too much war, and this is all being driven by wanting to be the big boys with the big toys. And I just think, why? What's the point? There's, we've got so much more that we could be spending our money on than weapons of mass destruction that just harm
all right.
people.
Leanne, thank you. Adrian in Berlin, how do you view Britain?
I'm a Brit myself. It seems as though the UK has become internationally absent for the last 6 years whilst it tries to sort itself out, which means other countries have probably taken over its role of trying to sort out the problems, as in with migrants, with bailing out certain countries, or, for example, with the Ukraine at the moment. They're also in the room whilst the UK is tweeting, or Liz Truss is tweeting from Australia.
Well, hang on a minute, because if you look at what Germany is doing with regard to Ukraine and compare it with what Britain is doing, I think sending 5,000 military helmets to Ukraine is frankly an insult from Germany. And Germany refused to let a British military plane overfly the country because it had 2,000 anti-tank missiles on board. That, I think, is Germany's influence on the wane, rather than Britain's, don't you?
Our foreign minister, or the foreign minister, went to Moscow to talk this through with Lavrov, met with Blinken. I haven't seen.
The British Defence Secretary. The British Defence Secretary is meeting with the Russian Defence Secretary. I mean, it's a bit rich speaking from Germany to criticise Britain on what's happening in Ukraine, if I may say so.
We de-escalated the situation last year in the winter before winter, and we will de-escalate it again without your help, as usual.
Okay, well, fighting talk there from Germany. Adrian, thank you very much indeed. Peter, you wanted to make a comment?
That was so, sorry, with all due respect to the person, that was really absurd to say that Germany is going to sort this out on its own, when it seems to many people that because of its situation with its energy supply, it's kowtowing to the Russians. Well done to Boris, well done to the Foreign Secretary for getting on.
Right, I want to get in 2 more questions before 9 o'clock, so I'm going to ask you all to be very brief in your answers to the next 2 questions if you can. It's 8:48.
This is LBC.
On LBC, we have Peter Bone, Antonia Jennings, Denise Headley and Leanne Wood with us. Next question from Val in Boreham Wood. Hi, Val.
Hiya. Is it time to have registration for bicycles like we do for cars?
Why do you ask?
Because there's no rule for them. They jump lights. I'll give you a quick example. My husband's blind. We were opposite Moorfields in City Road. He was crossing a road with his guide dog. Fortunately, I was with him. The lights were red for us to cross. This bike, I can't tell you how it sped by. We felt its wind in passing. It was going so fast. Everyone gasped. Had I not been with him and pulled him back, he would have got run over. There was no way. If that had been a car, I could have taken a registration number. We have rules. The highway code is changing, that we should give consideration to bikes. I agree with that. But we also need to know that if they're doing something wrong, and we need to support, to report them.
Okay. All right. Okay, Val, let's go to our panel. I don't know how many of you are cyclists. Denise Headley.
I am a cyclist, and I've got a twofold answer. I think on the one hand, for people with special needs or who are visually impaired, I can see the value of a registration system. But the other side of me is that bikes, for a lot of people, especially young people on low incomes, is their way of getting around. And if you then start taxing it, or not taxing it, but codifying in it, you then effectively don't allow them space to maneuver, and they're already planned out of the local community. We've got lots of spaces, lots of areas. So I'm slightly torn, but I can see the caller's point, but then I'm seeing the young people's point, and that's my 2 pence.
Antonia.
Yeah, I'd agree with Denise. I think the point can't be stressed enough that for a lot of people, cycling is their only means to get to work in an affordable manner, and also it's very emancipatory for a lot of children. But I completely understand where your caller is coming from. I think something I'd be keen to maybe unpack a little bit more is if we were to register bikes or have some sort of codifying system, does that then also mean a kind of licensing system, through which people would have to pass a test or something similar? And if so, that makes me a little bit nervous, because then the barrier to access cycling suddenly gets a lot higher.
Peter Bone.
It's a really interesting idea. I introduced a private members bill some time ago to make it compulsory for children who cycle to wear helmets. I would certainly think that's worth looking at, because there isn't really a cost implication for this, and there are some cyclists who do abuse the road, so it might well be good. It might well be something that a member like myself might put forward as a private members bill to get the debate going. I think it's worth exploring, definitely.
Well, Val, you might have inspired a piece of legislation here, or a piece of attempted legislation. Anyway, Leanne Wood, what do you think?
I agree with Denise and Antonia, really. We need to make it as simple and easy for people as possible to cycle and not put barriers in the way, although the caller does have a really valid point. And I think that it might be useful to look at it as a hierarchy, where cars are at the bottom of the hierarchy, people and pedestrians are at the top, and cyclists are in the middle, so that when we think about the rules of the road, the the pedestrians would have the top priority. And really what we need to be doing is making it as difficult as possible for people to drive cars and put as many obstacles in the way, or reduce the incentives for people to drive cars. Because something we haven't talked about on the programme at all tonight is the climate change imperative. And we can't get away from that, can we?
Well, Val, thank you very much indeed for your question. I won't come back to you because you explained your view in your question, and admirably brief answers from the panel. Thank you very much indeed. Tom is in Harlow and he sent in a text. He says, should we be focusing more on the abandonment of the people in Afghanistan rather than dogs? Antonia.
Yeah, so the first thing to say on this story is there's lots of contradicting accounts as to what happened, right? So we need an investigation into exactly what happened there. But look, what I would say is if the story is proven true, we need to question where the Conservative priorities lie. You know, during the withdrawal from Afghanistan, government saw many campaigners send in lists of incredibly vulnerable people who were still in Afghanistan, many of whom had actually been working for the British government, putting their lives on the line. And these campaigners and other pressure groups were told that emergency evacuation, frankly, wasn't possible. And if this story is proven true, we obviously have to seriously question the government's priorities of putting animals above people.
Leanne.
That evacuation operation was a complete disaster, and the whole thing is a scandal. There are people there now who have to go into hiding because they're not safe and they can't leave. And it's just appalling that the way that there was no planning. I mean, I can't really get my head around this story that surfaced today. If the Prime Minister did intervene and then subsequently was economical with the truth about that, then that just adds another layer of, we don't want to go back to the stories about Boris Johnson, I'm sure. But what's happened in Afghanistan is a scandal. It's as though now, though we've moved on, we're not talking about that anymore. There's still people there in danger, and there still needs to be every effort made to get them out. We haven't got time now to talk about the crisis with refugees, but of course the people who may be trying to cross the channel on those dodgy dinghies could well be linked back to our atrocities in Afghanistan, and the whole thing is an absolute disgrace.
That's a very strong word to use about British Armed Forces in Afghanistan, atrocities.
Well, I'm sure you saw the pictures of people hanging from airplanes when that operation was abandoned.
That was an American aeroplane.
Well, the UK and the Americans were in there together. I remember being involved in the anti-war campaign back in the early 2000s when all of this started off, and all of this was predicted. The collapse of the country, the rise of forces like ISIS. It was all predicted at the time, and it has happened, and no one is taking responsibility
for any of it. As far as I can see. Peter Bone.
I think it's extraordinary that Leanne says the atrocities of our forces. Our forces and the ambassador and the officials out did an extraordinary job in rescuing people from that country. And let's face it, the reason that mess occurred was because of the United States' unilateral decision. And today in Wellingborough, Helen Harrison has got the councillor there, was welcoming the first Afghan family to Wellingborough. And well done for doing that. My words fail me to say how I completely disagree with Leanne's description. I thought what our armed forces did and what our ambassador did was extraordinary.
How can you defend leaving those people there? How can you defend leaving those people there? How can you defend
I just find what you're saying outrageous, and I think you should apologise for it. But I
think what you're saying is outrageous. Those people have been left behind. They were working for the British Army and they were abandoned. That's what's disgraceful.
Thousands and thousands of people were rescued by our armed forces, and they put their lives at risk to do it. Can I say one thing, Iain, just separately? Isn't it nice to come on a programme where your listeners are asking us questions and they're about what they're worried about, and they're not about whether somebody's ate a piece of cake? I think it's a real pleasure to come on and talk about serious issues.
Well, we've had plenty of questions on that over the past few days, I can assure you, Peter. Denise, if you could be very brief, we're up against time.
I think it was wrong to place animals in front of human beings. And the question there about favouritism, which links to the previous question about leadership, I think is quite clear.
Admirably brief. Thank you all very much indeed. Antonia Jennings, Denise Headley, Leanne Wood and Peter Bone. If you want to catch up on the programme, you can do so at any time on the Cross Question podcast. Download it wherever you get your podcasts from. And you can, of course, watch our previous episodes on the LBC YouTube channel or Global Player. Coming up in a moment, we're going to ask a very controversial question. Should Jeremy Corbyn be allowed back in the Parliamentary Labour Party? The NEC of the Labour Party have said absolutely not. They voted on that yesterday. Laura Pidcock, one of their members, has resigned today from the NEC, and we'll be talking to her in a moment. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Prince Andrew is demanding a jury trial in the civil sexual assault case being brought against him in the US. Virginia Giuffre is suing the Duke of York, claiming it all happened when she was a teenager. He's always denied the allegations.